Yuri would wake up before the sun rose in the small town of Elmsworth. His hands, marked and rough, were silent witnesses to the countless hours he spent in the workshop repairing engines and saws of worn-out cars. With sweat on his brow and grease under his nails, he built a modest life but filled with warmth beside Annie. "Good morning, my love," he would say every morning with a smile that concealed his weariness. Annie, on the other hand, moved through the house with a grace that didn't belong to the modest world she shared with Yuri. While she polished the worn furniture and prepared simple yet tasty meals, her mind wandered through ballrooms and rooms adorned with the finest satin. "Will there ever be a day," she would begin, her voice trailing off in sighs as she imagined herself enveloped in silks and diamonds. One day, after a dinner of homemade tomato sauce pasta, Annie spoke hesitantly. "Yuri, don't you dream of more? Of a life that's more than this?" Yuri, whose dreams were colored by simple joys, responded with a loving squeeze of her hand. "Annie, we have love. We have health. We have each other. Isn't that more than enough?" But Annie, whose heart beat with unfulfilled desires, smiled sadly and whispered to herself, "But what if we could have more?" Deep inside, she nurtured the secret hope of one day being courted by luck and swimming in a sea of luxuries denied to her by life. While Yuri strove to play his role as a dedicated husband and provider, cherishing small joys and celebrating each humble achievement, Annie cultivated a voracious appetite for a world beyond the walls of their simple home. In rare moments of solitude, Annie's eyes would wander into the distance, gleaming with the reflection of a world she believed to be made of gold and glory. One day, she silently promised her reflection in the foggy mirror, "One day, Annie, I'll give you the world." With this unspoken promise lingering on her lips, Annie faced each new day unaware that destiny was already charting a path full of twists and turns that neither of them could foresee. On a muggy afternoon, the kitchen of the Harper's house filled with the scent of herbs and freshly baked bread. Mrs. Pauline, Annie's mother, maneuvered among pots and pans, her occasional gaze fixating on her daughter who wore a sad expression. "Annie, my daughter," she said with a voice softened by the wisdom of years, "the richest life isn't measured by the weight of gold, but by the lightness of the heart." She looked at her with eyes that had witnessed many autumns, hoping her words would sow seeds of contentment. Annie, whose soul was in turmoil, smiled at her mother with a trace of sadness in her lips. "I understand, Mom," she replied, "but I believe we deserve more than simplicity offers. I don't just want to survive, I want to live." Pauline sighed, leaning against the countertop. "Living isn't having more, Annie, it's being more." She retorted, "You and Yuri have built a home of love and laughter. That should be enough." However, Annie, whose heart beat to the rhythm of what she did not yet possess, shook her head slowly. "Mom, I love Yuri. I love you. But there's this voice inside me that won't be silenced, this burning desire for something greater. I can't just ignore it." It was then that the job offer arrived, a position that would place her among the elite, promising more than she had ever dared to dream. As she held the thick envelope, the offer shining in the printed words, she announced, "They want me, Mom. They see my worth." Pauline looked at her daughter, her eyes brimming with tears, and said, "I see a woman's worth through the love she gives and receives. Don't trade true treasure for glittering crumbs, my dear." But Pauline's words fell on deaf ears. With a conflicted heart but a mind seduced by images of grandeur and success, Annie made her decision. "I need to do this, Mom. Not just for myself, but for Yuri too. He deserves the world, and I'm going to give it to him." That night, as Pauline watched Annie through the window, a feeling of foresight enveloped her heart. She knew that the harshest lessons are often learned not through wisdom but through the consequences of choice. With a heavy sigh, she murmured a silent prayer, hoping that Annie would find her way back home. Annie then talked to Yuri about the job offer she had received. Yuri didn't want his wife to go because their life was simple, but they were happy. However, Annie was determined. So, a week later, Annie started her new job, aspiring to climb the ranks in the office. Where Annie had planted the roots of her ambition, the phone rang with a promise. It was the call that could change everything. Annie Harper, she answered, her voice steady but her hand trembling with anticipation. Annie, you've impressed all of us, echoed the voice on the other end of the line, a tone that perfectly matched the clinking of crystals and the whisper of silk suits. We're offering you a promotion. Get ready for a new world, my dear. Annie's heart raced with the ecstasy of triumph. She returned home where Yuri and the children were waiting and announced, "Our lives are about to change." Yuri, holding the children's hands, looked into Annie's eyes with a mix of admiration and trepidation. Annie, this is wonderful. But what does it mean for us, for our family? Annie, intoxicated by the vision of the peak she believed she was about to reach, replied confidently, "It means that everything we've worked for, everything we've dreamed of, is within our reach. The children will have the education they deserve, and you will have the life you've always wanted." But the truth was that the price of this new life was absence, a void that would settle between moments of reunion. "You'll be traveling all the time," Yuri argued. "We need you here, Annie." With the glow of achievement overshadowing prudence, Annie assured, "It'll be for a while, Yuri. Soon, we'll be living the life we've always deserved." The first trip came with the speed of a sudden storm. Annie kissed Yuri and the children, leaving behind her familiar scent and promises of a golden future. But the promise shattered against the unyielding sea when the plane, a titan of the sky, succumbed to its tragic fate. Yuri, standing in the living room now an echo chamber for the silence of a shattered future, received the news like a brutal blow. The children, still innocent of the permanence of loss, looked to Yuri for an explanation. They said the plane crashed, Yuri murmured, his voice breaking like waves against the rocks. "Mom?" Nothing more needed to be said. Grief took shape in that room, a presence as dense as the morning mist in Elmsworth. And as Yuri embraced the children, a silent pact was made, to survive, to carry on, even when the soul is in ruins. Yuri's house was now a beacon in the storm, its walls echoing the absence of Annie. He moved with a weary determination, waking up before dawn to prepare breakfast and organize the day for his children. Between school, work, and endless household chores, Yuri felt the gravity of his new responsibilities pressing in from all sides. "Come on, wake up," Yuri would gently call, even though his own body begged for 5 more minutes of forgetfulness. "Daddy made pancakes." The response was always a chorus of excitement that brought a melancholic smile to his lips. He saw Annie in the gestures and smiles of the children, and it both warmed and tore at his heart. Work at the workshop was both a refuge and a burden. Well-intentioned colleagues offered words of comfort and discreet invitations to dinners and social gatherings. "Yuri, you can't shut yourself off from the world," Marianne, a colleague who had long abandoned professionalism in favor of maternal concern, would say. Yuri would simply smile, his sad eyes hiding the love he refused to let die. "I appreciate the offer, Marianne, but my children need me now more than ever. I'm not ready for anything else." Returning home, Yuri would bend in 1,000 ways between preparing dinner and helping with homework. "Daddy, do you think Mommy would be proud of me?" Little Emily would ask, her innocence cutting through the haze of grief that Annie had tried to dispel. "Absolutely, sweetheart," Yuri would reply, holding his daughter's hand firmly. "Your mother would be more than proud. She's smiling down on us from heaven." In the silence of the night, while the house slept, Yuri allowed himself a moment of weakness, a tear escaping his armor of strength. He whispered into the emptiness, "Annie, help me be strong for our children." And so, day after day, Yuri wove the web of routine and resilience, a father, a mother, the center of the universe for 2 young lives. Always moving forward with the love for Annie still burning like an unquenchable flame deep in his soul. Annie's memory was a shadow that accompanied Yuri every step, an ethereal presence that resided in the corner of his eyes, in the laughter of the children, in the moments of silence that preceded sleep. Yuri held an old photo of the two of them, Annie's eyes shining with a promise of eternity that fate cruelly shattered. He ran his fingers over the image, almost hoping to feel the texture of Annie's skin, the reality of her presence. "Do you remember when we took this picture, Annie?" Yuri whispered into the emptiness, a solitary tear tracing a path down his face. You said the world was ours, and I believed it. The walls of his home seemed to close in with the strength of his pain, each room an altar to a different memory, a smile, a word of love, a hug that promised more than just comfort. Yuri got lost in the what-ifs, each one more painful than the last. What if Annie had stayed? What if ambition hadn't blinded him to the value of simplicity? You need to move on, Yuri, his sister Lisa advised him, a cup of hot coffee in her hands as she sat at the kitchen table. Annie wouldn't want to see you like this, stuck in the past. But the words, though spoken with care, were additional change to the weight Yuri already carried. I know, he replied, forcing a smile. But how do you move on when your other half has been torn away from you? At work, in the shared smiles with his children, and the small triumphs of everyday life, Yuri found fragments of peace. But they were just that, fragments. The night brought with it an unsettling quietude, and that's when Yuri returned to himself, in vivid dreams that were almost tangible. And so, in an endless cycle of remembrance and pain, Yuri struggled between the memory of a love that gave him life and the reality of grief that insisted on staying, a faithful specter that refused release, as much as Yuri himself refused to forget. The sea had a way of washing away the pain, Yuri thought, as he watched his children build sand castles under a cloudless sky. He had decided to take the kids for a weekend at the beach to try and forget some of the pain of loss that, even after 2 years, was still very much present. They had chosen Siesta Key Beach, with its white sands and crystal clear waters, a peaceful retreat to heal old wounds. The days had been a sequence of children's laughter and cheerful shouts as the waves lapped at their bare feet, eliciting laughter even from the most reserved of passers-by. Hey, Dad, look how I swim! Little Max exclaimed, splashing water in all directions with unbridled joy. Yuri smiled silently, grateful for that moment of forgetfulness, that interlude of genuine happiness. You're a little fish, Max. A real little fish, he shouted back, applauding and encouraging his son's growing confidence. At night, in the small rented cottage, Yuri read stories to them, their voices intertwining in a gentle, steady rhythm, the words a balm for wounds still not fully visible. Do you think Mommy would have liked it here, Emily? The eldest asked, her inquisitive eyes seeking Yuri's. Without a doubt, sweetheart, Yuri replied with a sad smile. She loved the sun and the sea almost as much as she loved us. On the last day, Yuri decided to take the children for a walk along the northernmost shore, where mansions overlooked the sea like guardians of another world, a world that Annie had yearned for but that Yuri had learned to observe from afar without desiring it. They look like castles, Dad, Emily remarked, her big eyes taking in the splendor. And they are, in a way, Yuri agreed, but our happiness doesn't need walls to exist. It was then, amid a smile and a playful moment, that Yuri spotted someone. His heart stopped, his smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. The silhouette on the sand, walking with a familiar grace, carried with it the promise of a story Yuri thought had ended. The waves crashed, but the sound was drowned out by the cacophony of his own heart. Dad, Emily called, tugging at his shirt sleeve, are you okay? Yuri swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the figure that was awakening ghosts from the past. Yes, sweetheart, he said, his voice a nearly lost whisper in the wind. I think the past has one more story to tell. At that moment, the beach had a different air, laden with a saltiness that seemed to condense hopes and memories into tiny suspended droplets. Yuri felt his heart pounding in his ears, a disjointed percussion marking the rhythm of a suddenly distorted reality. Just a few meters away, at the intersection between the wet and dry sand, a figure walked with the familiarity of a dream often dreamt and equally forgotten at dawn. Dad, look, exclaimed Emily, her small, firm hand pulling at Yuri's shirt. It's Mommy, Annie, isn't it? Her brother Max, with wide eyes and the plastic bucket forgotten next to the unfinished sandcastle, jumped excitedly. She's back. She's back. Mommy, Annie. But Yuri remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the figure that carried the walk, the posture, the silhouette of the one he had cried for, buried within his heart and tried to forget. His reasoning clashed with the impossibility, with the insane hope growing in his children. It can't be, Yuri murmured, more to himself than to the little ones by his side. But how to explain to the children? How to tell them that the impossible sometimes dresses in everyday clothes and strolls on sunlit beaches? Yuri knew he had to act to uncover the truth behind that glimpse that threatened to reopen old wounds. "You two stay here," Yuri said, his voice tinged with an authority he barely felt. "I'll go check if it's who we think it is." Max and Emily waved, unable to contain the frenzy of revived hope, as Yuri moved forward with steps that were meant to be firm but brought an uncontrollable tremor. Approaching, the resemblance became sharper, more cutting, and the sea breeze was no longer enough to cool his forehead, now beaded with sweat. It was as if each step took him back in time, each grain of sand a backward second on a clock he had broken to never look at again. The figure Yuri followed walked with a confidence that clashed against the reality of his memory, each step a dissonant chord in the melody of his life with Annie. The voice was the same, that familiar tone that Yuri would never forget. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," Yuri said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. "You're supposed to be dead, Annie, or you should be. What is this? How? Why?" Annie hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. "It's complicated, I can't." "Complicated?" Yuri's anger overflowed, a wave that could not be contained. "I buried you, we cried for you, and now you're here, living as if nothing happened. You left our children, our life for this." Annie lowered her head, a gesture of defeat. "Yuri, please, I can explain." "You're right," Yuri said, each word heavier than the last. "It's complicated, but I deserve the truth. Our children deserve the truth." Annie then said, "I'll tell you everything." "Where are our children?" So Yuri called the children, and they all walked to a perfect house, one of those mansions that Max thought were castles. Yuri took a hesitant step inside the mansion, crossing the threshold that separated the past from the present, the lie from the truth, the life he knew from the life he was about to discover. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the opulent mansion as Yuri stood firm at the door. His eyes roamed the previously unknown territory, every luxurious detail cutting him like a blade. Annie embraced their children with those longing hugs. However, Yuri soon interrupted and asked the kids to play in the corner while they talked. "Yuri," Annie began, but Yuri raised a hand, cutting her off. "No, don't say my name as if nothing has changed," Yuri fired his words, laden with deep bitterness. "How could you, abandoning your family, your own children?" Annie tried to interject. "I thought that you thought," Yuri scoffed with a humorless laugh. "And what did you think, Annie? That you could build a new life and we would be just disposable memories?" "I was wrong," Annie admitted, her voice a quiet confession, "but I never stopped loving." "Love?" Yuri cut her off again. "Your love is a sham. You faked your death to be with someone rich. You left behind your children, your husband." Annie lowered her head, an admission of guilt in her posture. "Yuri, I was lost, entangled in ambitions and illusions that I thought I wanted. Save your explanations for someone who might still have the misfortune to believe them," Yuri said coldly. "I only came here for closure, to be able to tell our children that their mother was." Annie looked at Yuri, a silent plea in her eyes. "Let me hug them, for me." "No, but our children are not to blame for the irresponsible mother they have." Yuri's rejection was vehement, final. "You chose your life, Annie, now live it away from us. I can't stop you from seeing your children, but whatever I can do to avoid seeing you, I will." Yuri waited for Annie to hug their children, and at the first opportunity, he turned, took each child's hand, and left the mansion, each step taking him away from the woman he thought he loved. Within him, something broke and mended at the same time, the hard shell of pain finally beginning to give way to the determination to move forward. Not just for himself, but for the children who still had a whole world to discover. At that moment, facing the mansion that seemed to swallow the daylight with its grandeur, Annie felt the weight of a world collapsing on her shoulders. And Yuri, on the way back to his hotel, left a trail of jagged stones, each step a reminder of the bitter truths he now carried in his heart. Back in the room, looking at the sleepy faces of his children, Yuri knew he had to try to ease the situation with his children. They were just kids, and they couldn't grow up hating their mother. At night, as the moon bathed the room in its silvery glow, Yuri told a story to the children. Not the real story, but one that could offer some comfort. Your mother, she was an amazing woman, Yuri began, his voice gentle and firm. She fought bravely through many storms, and her plane crashed, and she hit her head. She couldn't find her way back, and there, in that house, she found someone to help her. And now that we found her, she'll come whenever she can to see you. The children listened attentively, and in their eyes, Yuri saw the reflection of the moon, creating a bridge between the present and memories of a happier past. She won't live with us anymore, Dad, the small voice of one of the children interrupted the silence, filled with uncertainty and dreams. Yuri nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. No, my love. But she lives in that house now. But whenever she can, she comes to see you. Holding them tight, Yuri made a silent promise to keep the truth hidden under layers of comforting stories and life lessons. The following days unfolded with a new determination, and reality, though painful, became the foundation for a fresh start. Yuri now knew that to truly move forward, he had to leave the past where it belonged, behind them, in a story that could only be told by the waves of the sea and the whisper of the wind. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.